Oh, goody.
Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again. And today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today I had kind of an interesting topic I wanted to talk about. And that is kind of the comparison of last month's meta with Loki and the one we're having right now, really kind of focused around Elsa Bloodstone. One thing I noticed, I think many of you have noticed as well, is there were a lot of complaints about Loki last season. I was definitely one of those people, was not a fan of Loki whatsoever. Did get better over time, probably because of the addition of Mobius being a big part of that. Unfortunately, that didn't happen until almost the end of the season. So Loki got to kind of wreak havoc for a rather long time, pretty much the majority of the season, and I think it led to a frustrating experience for many. Now, Elsa Bloodstone has come out and has also kind of flipped the meta on its head a bit, and even though it's a really powerful, and I'm sure many would probably agree, maybe a bit too powerful of a season pass card, you aren't seeing the same levels of, hey, I hate this card, why is everyone playing Elsa, can we nerf Elsa? You're not seeing the same level of complaints about Elsa as we were seeing about Loki. And I thought it'd be an interesting topic to dive into, why I think people are much more okay with Elsa than they were with Loki last season. So the first thing I want to talk about here is the fundamental impact of these cards. So Elsa, what has she been doing to the metagame? Well, she gave a pretty big boost to Kitty Pride decks, as Kitty really makes good use of her effect. However, there are a variety of decks that are using Kitty. You have bounce decks, you have move decks, even just some tempo focus decks. There are quite a few different decks that this card slots into, and you're even seeing people make use of Elsa not purely in Kitty decks. I think one of the issues Loki had was most of the Loki decks were fairly similar, where you just threw in a bunch of card generation. Some people went the Dino route, but I think that was generally agreed upon to be pretty bad in the mirror, because you're giving your opponent a Dino, and you're often not playing your Dino unless you're missing out on your Loki, in which case you're probably already not in a great spot to begin with. But Loki had, I think, a much more toxic impact on the metagame for two main reasons. One, Loki massively pushed out a lot of other decks in the metagame that were generally, quote-unquote, good cards kind of decks. Things like Darkhawk, things like the move deck. Any deck where you were playing things that were generally efficient for their cost got absolutely sent to Clown Town by Loki, because Loki would just get your deck, play it better than you could at a 1 cost, or with Quinjet 2 cost reduction. There really wasn't much you could do about that. You just kind of had to roll over and take it, and it was not a fun experience. For me, that is the thing I have hated most about Loki, is not only his impact on pushing out a lot of other decks, but the fact that your opponent has very little opportunity cost of playing the card. It's already an overstated 3-drop that is making a really, really big collector, and then they just get to punish you for running cards that are otherwise good cards that you would want to run in your deck anyway. So I really didn't like the impact it had on deck building, and I think in general it creates a super feels bad experience when your opponent feels like they're just doing your deck better than you did without even having to actually put any of those specific cards in their own deck. So that's one of the big things I found super frustrating about the card. I've seen a lot of people kind of agree about that. While I'll admit the Loki stuff is very thematic and whatnot, I think that is kind of the worst part about the card, was just how it had such a crazy impact on the meta, and the fact that the mirrors were utterly miserable. And a big reason why the mirrors were miserable was because they felt very one-sided. If one person got their Loki, the other didn't. It was often a total blowout. And if both players got Loki, it kind of turned into a ridiculous situation of, well, Loki generates another Loki, and you keep rolling Loki, so you keep pumping the collector to see who gets the bigger stats. Now, I will admit, at high levels of play, there was intricacy in the Loki matchup. As much as it gets complained about for being a very straightforward deck, I do think there is intricacy in the mirror matches, and in general, someone who is very good at piloting the deck will have a much better performance than someone who is just mediocre at it. And that can be fun for people who kind of like that deck or like those mirrors and testing of skill cap, but as someone who really didn't like the deck, I just found it incredibly unenjoyable. I know some people who do enjoy it, and that's great, but I just really wasn't a fan of the mirrors personally. One thing that I think speaks to a lot of people when it comes to card games is the deck building. You like toying around and coming up with a unique idea, and it feels really, really bad to have someone get to not only not make that deck on their own, but actually get to benefit from the unique synergies you're trying to leverage. Now, Loki wasn't impossible to beat, but Loki definitely encouraged running decks that were very combo specific, so that way when they stole your cards, unless they got a very specific sequence of cards, they often couldn't use them nearly effectively as you could. A great example of that was the Phoenix Force deck that started popping up and doing well against Loki, because Loki couldn't effectively leverage the Phoenix Force cards very effectively. So in terms of the metagame impact, I think Loki has had an impact unlike any other card we've ever seen, where he completely flipped the game on its head. He'd also reduce cards like Shang-Chi being played in the meta, because you'd have to worry about getting hit by your own Shang-Chi, and Loki decks generally didn't want to run Shang-Chi because of things like the mirror match, where you often wouldn't have time to play your own Shang, and if you're up against another Loki deck, you're just essentially giving them a reduced cost Shang. Now, when it comes to Elsa, there's no doubt that she has had a pretty big impact on the meta herself. Card is very powerful. As we've seen in the past with things like Silver Surfer and Forge, a +3 stat buff is really huge. If you trigger Elsa just 2 times, she is a 2/8, and anything more than that is just absolutely insane. And we've kind of seen that with Collector and Loki, right? Because one of the reasons Loki is so powerful is not just because of the mana reduction on the cards he takes from your opponent, but the fact that you have a very good 2-drop payoff in making a very large Collector. Collector even got nerfed for the Sins of Loki, which I think was a pretty controversial decision, as players did like running Collector in other decks, and now it feels like he's really just not that great unless you're running him specifically in a Loki deck. This was also a complaint about the nerf to Snowguard. I think a lot of players were enjoying running Snowguard in a wide variety of decks, but because Loki was using it most efficiently, the card got nerfed, and now you really don't see it seeing a whole ton of play outside of Loki shells, which I think was pretty disappointing. Another reason why I think people are not quite as angry about Elsa is because we already have tools to kind of deal with what this card is doing, whereas with Loki, the only tool we really had was something like Wave to lock down the amount of stuff they could play, but oftentimes Loki was so good at fighting for the board in the early game, you'd be behind going into your Wave turn, and then you just end up getting screwed over because you couldn't outpower them with one card. A tech card that has risen to prominence in the wake of Elsa has been Shadow King. Shadow King has been rather effective at shutting down a lot of the Elsa stuff, and to the point where a lot of decks have started running Luke Cage as kind of just a general defense mechanism. I think it's a much better feeling to know that there are cards that were already in the game and more accessible to help deal with this card, rather than have to rely on buying another new card in Mobius just to rein it in, especially when Mobius himself was kind of controversial because a lot of cards got caught up in the collateral damage of his ability to just totally shut down cost reduction effects, which I think a lot of people haven't been the happiest about. People like reducing the cost of their cards. It's a fun thing to do in card games. Loki was just doing it way too efficiently, so we needed some kind of answer, but it feels like one of those situations where they kind of created the problem in order to sell the solution, which doesn't really feel that great. Another big element here is that you generally know what you're playing against when you're up against an Elsa deck. They usually make it kind of apparent to you which variant they are of Elsa in the early game in the first few turns, and you can generally kind of figure out how many points you are expected to have to beat. One thing with Loki was that there was a lot of uncertainty with this card. It wasn't really reasonable to try and play around every single card in your deck, because you don't really know, hey, they generated 5 or 6 of my cards. Do I play around them having my Iron Man or my Doom? Like, you can't realistically play around all these cards, and sometimes you could screw yourself over by trying to play around one specific card and they might not even have it. It just kind of removed a lot of the thought of having to think about, hey, this is what my opponent's running and what I have to play around and how I can react to it, whereas you just can't really do that when there was so much RNG involved with Loki and having to play around your own cards. Another thing that I think is a big point of why there isn't as much complaining going on right now is the fact that there is much more variety right now than we were seeing last month. Last month, it really felt like Loki was just such a crazy high percentage of the metagame. I think it peaked at like 30 or 35% according to Untapped's data, and that's just insane. That is such a crazy part of the metagame. I'm sure the Elsa decks are doing numbers, but again, not all Elsa decks feel the same, and it feels like there are more options out there aside from just playing Elsa. You still have the Iron Patriot deck doing very well. Loki decks even post Mobius. Now, they might not be the most busted deck in the game, but they're still putting out decent numbers and offer a different kind of strategy. You're seeing people start to run junk decks because Loki and Elsa often fill up their board a bunch, so being able to lock them down with Titania or Green Goblin or some rocks can be a decently effective strategy. It feels like there's just a more variety in terms of what I'm seeing this month, as opposed to last month where a lot of the Loki decks really looked the same, and they took up such a huge percentage of the metagame share. High Evo is still good and still seeing quite a lot of play, even in spite of a lot of decks adding Luke Cage. Shang-Chi has also started to creep his way back into the meta a little bit now to deal with some of the very high point outputs from things like Elsa, and I think we're going to see people continue to experiment with some reactive decks with things like Invisible Woman, Killmonger, Shadow King stuff that we saw when Bounce was initially really popular and powerful a few months ago. So yeah, those are my general thoughts. I thought this was a fun topic. Obviously, I'm biased. I'm not going to hide that bias. I've had a much more enjoyable experience with the game this month than I did last month, even though I would definitely be someone who says Elsa's probably a bit overpowered. But I think part of that bias stems from the fact that I mind this meta a lot less than the last one just because of how much I really hated the Loki meta. It is probably one of the worst times I've had playing the game since the initial Zabu season or when Shuri was originally out of control for like 2 or 3 months. So ultimately, the conclusions I've come to here are basically that it feels like Elsa, there's more options to tech against the card, and your expectations of what the card is going to do in terms of power output are a lot more reasonable and predictable than what we saw in Loki. And on top of that, we're just seeing a more diverse meta as a result of the fact that it's not one deck that's the top dog that's dictating the kind of entire rest of the metagame right now, which was definitely the case in the Loki season, at least until we got Mobius. But a big part of why I wanted to do this was I wanted to hear from other people. I wanted to hear from the community what you think about this. Do you agree with what I've had to say here? Does this make sense? Do you feel differently? Maybe you liked the Loki season more than the Elsa season. I'd be really curious to know. So looking forward to reading in the comments what people have to say about this. But that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.